And what's your pleasure?
From the Thomaston Place Auction Galleries in Thomaston, Maine, I'm Elizabeth McLeod with Auction Waves.
32,500, 100,000 there. Players all over the house, 400,000 on this rare piece, and 600,000, 900,000, 1 million, 1,175 once, 100 million, 175 twice. We all good? Sold.
Fine art is never just what you see on the surface. Sometimes that's a figurative statement, an implication of the depths to be explored in any artist's work, where the images are merely the catalyst for the exploration of broader themes. But sometimes you can interpret those words literally. Sometimes there really is more to the painting than meets the eye. That's what happened at our galleries recently with an enigmatic painting by Monhegan artist James Fitzgerald. On this edition of Auction Waves, we'll explore that mystery. But first, the latest auction news. The days are counting down fast for our 4-day Autumn Majestic auction, coming up November 6th through November 9th, with a globe-spanning assortment of artwork, distinctive furnishings, rare collectibles, historic firearms, fine jewelry, unique automobiles, and lots more. The furniture selections available in this auction are particularly interesting, spanning over 250 years. Among the offerings, several handcrafted pieces from the Maine workshop of Thomas Moser, whose blending of the best of classic and modern style earned for him an honored place in the history of contemporary furniture design. Also notable for this auction is our new streamlined online registration form. If you're ready to register for phone or absentee bidding, just visit thomastonauction.com, and after choosing your items from our online catalog, scroll down to the Register to Bid link. Open the menu and scroll to our phone absentee bid form. You'll get an easy-to-follow online form that'll have you in on the bidding in no time. This is Auction Waves, and I'm Elizabeth McLeod. When our friends at the Monhegan Museum informed us recently that lot 4380 in our Autumn Majestic auction might be hiding a surprise, we took that information seriously. Our auctioneer and art expert Kaja Veyu carefully opened the frame and revealed that this bold watercolor by artist James Fitzgerald wasn't the only image on the paper. On the reverse side of the sheet, another image by Fitzgerald, this one in brooding black and white. Why was this second work there? Why was it hidden? Who were the figures depicted? We turned to Fitzgerald authority Dr. Susan Danley for the answers. Susan retired in 2012 as Senior Head Curator of the Portland Museum of Art and is well acquainted with Monhegan's unique place in Maine art. Well, let's set the scene with a bit of background on Mr. Fitzgerald. I understand he was something of a child prodigy. He started painting at a very, very young age. Was there something in his family background that might have led to that?
Well, I think it was the love of his mother. She was very instrumental in encouraging him as a young boy to pursue the arts. It wasn't anything that the family had any history in, but she recognized that he had some talent and encouraged him to sketch and draw and so forth. And when time came for him to go to art school, after he had graduated from high school, I think it was her encouragement that made him go in that direction, because it certainly was uncommon during that era.
Well, he lived a fairly conventional life for a young, talented college man until after the First World War. He came home, and how did he end up a common sailor on board a ship?
We're not sure what the particular event was that precipitated his interest in the ship, but he comes from Boston, which, of course, as a city, is rooted in its sea lore and so forth. Familiar with the north shore of Boston and the fishing villages like Gloucester that were there, that were both fishing communities and artist communities. And I think that's a strain in his career that runs all the way through from the very beginning to the end of his days.
He was born with the smell of the sea in his lungs.
Exactly.
And you never get that out
Yeah.
once it's there. Well, how did he happen to end up with the Cannery Row crowd in California? This is an interesting group of people.
Yeah, well, that goes back to his Boston days. Before he even enrolled in art school, he went to the Mass Normal School, which is now called the Massachusetts School of Art and Design. Graduated there in 1923, and then he shipped out. He went on a fishing boat called the Elizabeth Howard to the Grand Banks off of New England. And they went out for a summer of catching fish. And so he was at sea for quite a long time. And the reason that the crew wanted him wasn't for his fishing expertise, but the fact that he could draw portraits. And so he produced many portraits of the sailors on that ship. And we are very fortunate here in Maine that the Farnsworth has a terrific collection of not only pictures of his fellow sailors, but also of the boat itself. So we have a real sense of him and the sea from an early point in his life, even before he became a professional artist, when he was still a student. He then went on to study with Aldro Hibbard in Rockport, which is another important place where the arts and fishing cross over in the community there.
Is that Rockport, Mass?
Rockport, Massachusetts,
right.
Yes. And if you go down there today, you'll still see people out there sketching, amateur artists, professional artists, and so forth. In any case, when he got back to shore in late 1923 in the fall, he went back to sketching and trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life. And he got a very fortuitous invitation to go out to visit a friend of his from art school, a painter named Lee Court, who had a house out there. And so he went out in 1924 to the island for the first time. It's a small island. It's about 10 miles off the coast of mid-coast Maine. And it had, however, a very active artist community, even as early as the 1920s. We know that artists were working on the island in the late 19th century, mostly as summer artists. They come out and stay for a week, 2 weeks, sometimes the entire summer, but mostly for shorter periods of time. Both men and, I'm happy to say, women artists were welcomed on the island. And because the island was populated by lobstermen, they really had no other contact outside of the fishing community and themselves. And this is the community that he's introduced to as a young person. And I think it really set his mind in the direction that he wanted to work on.
It sounds a bit bohemian for the early 20s.
It was pretty bohemian in those days. Aside from Monhegan, though, he seemed to seek out other places like that. So he went to Ipswich, Massachusetts, which had a lot of amateur artists. He went to Ogunquit, which actually had a big artist scene, and particularly modern artists from New York would come up to Ogunquit, and then Monhegan. So during that time, there were all sorts of artists that he could have talked to who had connections with the rest of the world. So unlike his school education in the arts, which was very much geared to the Boston art scene, his horizons ironically began to broaden when he gets out to this island off the coast of Maine. And then after Monhegan in 24, he decides he wants to go to sea again. He goes down to the Caribbean, seeking, I think, pretty much different colors and different lights. He knew Monhegan back and forth by the time that he left, but he wanted more color, I think, introduced to his work. And we really attribute that trip down to the Caribbean, where he was on a vessel as a able-bodied seaman. He wasn't fishing down there, but he did all sorts of paintings, watercolors, and oils when he was down there. And then the First World War breaks out, and he joins the Marines, and again, an organization with ties to the sea and the land. And he serves for a year and a half until the war is over, and then back again to Boston after that was over, and trying to figure out where his niche was, really. He had lots of friends, artist friends, with which, he could converse and talk about his work. But I think he really wanted to set out for something that was a little broader in its horizons. And that's when he comes up with this idea of sailing. He wants to go to Alaska to fish. So in order to get from Boston to Alaska in those days, you had to get on some kind of freighter, basically. I mean, there weren't cruise ships like there are today. You'd get on a freighter, in which he did because he had his able-bodied seaman certificate. He could do that. And he sets off from Boston through the Panama Canal up the coast of California. And he hears that there are fishing boats to be gotten a berth on in San Francisco Bay. And so they pull into San Francisco Bay. Most of the boats, however, were, I think he said, really just sitting in mud flats and didn't look like they were going anywhere. So he gets on another freighter and starts heading towards Alaska. That boat breaks down off the coast of California, not far from the Bay Area. So he sort of throws in the towel on his dream to go to Alaska and goes back to San Francisco. and starts to regroup and think about where he wants to go. And he hears about the town of Monterey. The Monterey Bay Peninsula is south of the Bay Area, at the bottom of that peninsula, and was just emerging. It was an important fishing port in those days. Sardines was the big catch in those days. But it was also becoming important as a resort. And there was a big hotel in Monterey. And one of the things that they did, like many hotels across the nation in the 20s, was open a little art gallery for the visitors. And so he soon made friends with the other artists who were showing there, sort of learned the ropes of what kinds of subjects appealed to vacationers and so forth, and really began to show almost as soon as he got to Monterey in 1928. He begins to see a future for himself on the West Coast, although he had no connection to it before this time.
But he fell in with some interesting intellectual circles while he was out there.
Yes.
John Steinbeck, Doc Rickett,
yeah.
John Cage.
Yes.
What drew these people together? This is a very Greenwich Village thing going on in California.
And literally on the end of Cannery Row, which everybody knows from the Steinbeck stories,
Right.
but it was a cannery. The joke about the Monterey Bay Peninsula is it's made up of 3 towns. One is Monterey itself, which stinks like fish. Then there's Pacific Grove, which is where the Methodists settled, and it was full of prayers. And then the other place was Carmel. And those are the 3 places that people still go to today. And Carmel was full of young artists beginning to show their work. Galleries were popping up, and there was also a theater there. And Fitzgerald liked theater. He actually acted in some plays while he was there, painted sets and so forth. So he was sort of active in all of those 3 areas, and it really fulfilled, I think, his sense of adventure, but also the sort of broad sweep of that sense of adventure. It wasn't just the arts. So the group of intellectuals that gathered on Cannery Row included Doc Ricketts, who was a marine biologist, and he collected specimens that he sold to schools and so forth. But he was really the sort of the guru, if you will, of the intellectual group there. And then there were painters who taught Asian painting techniques, particularly Chinese watercolor, which became incredibly important for Fitzgerald. And then Steinbeck, whose stories, of course, everyone loved. And Fitzgerald did his portrait while he was a young man there, and would go to the weekly sessions where musicians like John Cage would have played. He also met his future wife. I'm not sure if it was actually at Cannery Row, but she was a modern dancer, and she was drawn to Cannery Row, I know, because of the modern dance scene that was there. So it's a very diverse group, but all of those influence, in a way, intertwine in the adult Fitzgerald once he decides who he is and what he's going to paint.
So he's caught up in this thriving, vibrant art scene on the West Coast. Why did he come back to Maine?
Well, he first began to show his work on the West Coast. And there were very active watercolor organizations, particularly in the Los Angeles area. So he would send his watercolors down to be shown. And I think he realized that while that was an interesting market, he also had a market on the East Coast. And I think part of that was one of the reasons that he would come back to the East Coast. He at one point bought an old Woody station wagon. He'd load up his paintings in there, drive across country, knock on doors. He loved particularly Vermont and Maine are the 2 places he loved the best, but he knew the art dealers were all in New York. And so eventually he's down in New York, knocking on doors like everybody else during the 30s, trying to get people interested in his art. And that's when he gets his foot into the New York art world.
And then he came to Monhegan, of all places.
And then he comes to Monhegan, of all places. And as I said, he knew of it from his early school days, basically. He was not a professional artist when he first went out there. But he realized that a lot of the artists that were on the island in the 30s and later came from New York. So he made contacts with those New York artists, which helped him build his career in New York.
So let's discuss the specific piece that you've come here today to see. Lot 4380 in our current auction.
Right.
The front presenting side of the frame sheet shows a group of 3 fishermen in 2 rowboats. The title is 2 Dories. But on the other side of the sheet, in black and white, we have an image of 2 women, a very blocky, unusual image against a waterfront background and some rather abstract seagulls. Why do we have 2 images on one sheet?
Well, we've gotten up to the 1930s in talking about his work. And so the next decade, the 40s, is really critical to the understanding of these works. Of course, he was living on the West Coast when the war broke out, and everybody there, because of Pearl Harbor, was much more sensitive about the threat from that side of the country than on the East Coast, where they thought they were just sending all their soldiers to Europe. There was a great deal of fear that they were more vulnerable on the West Coast. And I think the military presence was also probably upsetting to him. So he goes back east and decides that he will concentrate on scenes that are identifiably East Coast fishing scenes. So in the two dories, what we have are two fishermen, and it's a little indistinct as to exactly what kind of fishing they're doing, but my best guess on this is that they are doing a type of fishing called seining, where a seine net is thrown off overboard from a dory, and usually more than one dory, because what would happen is the dories would circle around and the net would go down in between all of them, sort of like penning the fish in between. And then by hand, the fishermen would be pulling up all of these fish. And of course, the closer that it got, the heavier the net was, because it was full of fish. When it first went in, it was just the net, and they'd pull it out. And this was one of the scenes that really captured his imagination. It captured the strength of the fishermen that were there. It captured the abstract shapes of the dories, which are these sort of pea pod shaped boats with a very pointed bow and a dull point at the end. So it gives you an idea of a pea pod, and often that's the word that's used to describe a dory. And you see them today, even today, when you go out and look at old boats on the East Coast. So that's his first one. And I think that is probably also related to some of the other many seining pictures that he did, because the hull of these fishing boats in this particular painting were white or gray colored, light colored. Other scenes from Monhegan later, the boats tend to be more wooden colored, browns and tans and so forth. So I think it relates to that series of the seiners, even though there's only two boats in this one.
Now, there's a ragged quality to this picture. Would you say that it is a completed work, or is he sort of at a mid-stage on this?
I think he's in mid-stage on this one. It looks unfinished to me. There are passages up, particularly at the top part of the drawing, where he hasn't filled in any of the details. You kind of see where he's going, because there'll be swatches of color and brushwork and so forth, but you don't see any detail. The detail is mostly in the actual boats and in the fishermen in this particular painting. And in other ones related to it, it's a much more overall finished composition. So I think he's working on this as a sketch, which leads us to our discussion of the work on the back side of this, and the fact that these both were done during the Second World War. Fitzgerald often preferred quite expensive papers. Sometimes he imported papers from England, which would have not been available during the war, or if he had any, he would have been using it double-sided so that he would get the most out of it. So I think because one side was an unfinished sketch, it gave him leeway to look at the backside as a blank canvas or a blank piece of paper, and to work on another totally unrelated composition. And the one on the backside of the fisherman is a scene of two women marching up a hill, which we actually know is Monhegan from the buildings in the background, which are only sketched in with either charcoal or some kind of very loose pencil. So you can see the profile of the roof lines and so forth. And those buildings are still identifiable today. And you can see at the end of the wharf, it's depicted on the far left of this picture, the docking mechanism where the boats come in today and the ramp goes down and freight can get unloaded and so forth. Now, the women that are the center of this composition are very odd. They have no faces. And it looks like, if you look under the top layer of the sort of cross-hatched black lines on their faces, that he started out putting facial features in and then changed his mind. He didn't want to concentrate on what they looked like or who they were.
So he crossed them out.
He crossed them out, literally. Now, the folks on the Monhegan Island think that they know who these two people are because of accounts of a funeral that took place at that time. So it's possible that we may be able to identify them more positively. But it's a very loosely handled drawing. It has some watercolor-like swashes of gray and black, very fluid handling of the brush. You can see strokes in the far right corner that you can just see the brush swirling around and making those marks. These are all aspects of his art that he brought with him from the West Coast and from his understanding of Chinese painting. So this work embodies both coasts in a very strange way. But in terms of the subject matter, it's the East Coast. In terms of the technique, it's all about the West Coast and Asia. And that's one of the distinctive features of his work in general. And it's rare to find both of those things on one piece of paper, which makes this a really marvelous piece to understand his career and freedom with which he approached a particular subject.
I'm looking at this image, and I'm struck by just the I don't know if it's because it's in black and white or what, but the lugubriousness of it. It's so, the weight of the world is bearing down on these figures in a way that is almost jarring under the weight of whatever their minds.
Looks like they're pulling, or maybe the wind's blowing, because people who've been out to the island can tell you how bitter it can be in the winter, and you just sort of have to hunker down. But that brooding sense of emotion that is wrapped up in this work is also, I think, related to works that are similar with women trudging up a hill or down a hill. And those are burial scenes that he did, not only on Monhegan, but in Ireland, where he went later in his career. There are several pictures done of funeral processions in Ireland where you get the same exact emotional feeling. And I'm thinking that this Monhegan work is also related to those later Irish works. The other aspect of this particular work that links it to the Irish is the fact that although he was a very good portraitist, and I said he had painted portraits from the earliest time he was an artist, these later works, the facial features are almost not visible. Either their face is sort of blank, or there's just a mere stroke of paint to suggest an eye or a mouth, but there's no attempt to draw the face or the characteristics of a personality or anything like that. And that gives these women a particularly grim appearance.
Now, he certainly isn't the sentimental realist that people tend to equate with Maine art in quotation marks. But I look at his work as somebody who grew up here, and I see a very realistic assessment of what it means to be from Maine, with all of its jagged edges. I think there's almost, and he didn't work in urban surroundings, but there's almost an ashcan sensibility in a lot of his work.
Well, it's funny that you mention ashcan, because one of the most important early artists on Monhegan was Robert Henry, the founder of the Ashcan School from Scenes of New York. And indeed, we know that when Fitzgerald was in Monterey, he painted street scenes. Scenes with old cars from the late 20s and the early 30s are prominent in it. So you can date the picture by the types of cars or the types of stores that are visible in those. Those kinds of things that date his work are gone by the time that he goes out to Monhegan. And that's where this sort of timelessness of his work seems to come in. It also comes around in pictures that he did of animals, and he was a great painter of animals. We just did a show on the island last year about his animals, but there's all sorts of subjects that he brings a different feel to depending on when it was painted in his career. And remember, the 30s and the 40s were the Depression and the war.
It was a very grim time.
Yeah, grim times.
It was time to paint grim things.
Yeah.
If there's a canon of Maine art, where would you place Fitzgerald in it?
I think that he's one of the important and distinctive artists of the 20th century. He's not as well known as some of the other painters, and it's partly because of the trajectory of his career. So if you think of someone who was born in 1899, when Winslow Homer is creating some of his most famous paintings that are shown in New York and so forth, we know that Fitzgerald must have seen them. He was also, of course, very popular in Boston. Boston owned a number of Homer paintings, so we know he must have had that back in the early part of his career as the beginnings of a real Maine art. The seascapes and so forth that were done at Prout's Neck, he must have known. And the other person that I think he needs to be looked at in comparison with, and I don't think anyone's ever done this, is with Marsden Hartley, the great painter of Maine, who comes back to Maine after his European sojourn before the war breaks out, but comes back to Maine to Georgetown and starts another little small artist colony. But he and Fitzgerald share a complete love of Katahdin and painted Katahdin over and over again. And I would love some exhibition to compare their two works together, because I think they really can bear scrutiny in the way in which they, different approaches, but different ways of viewing Katahdin, which is such a classic Maine subject from the beginning of time.
Well, I hope that museum officials who are listening to us today take this hint and that they mount such an exhibition next summer, and we would all look forward to attending that. I love Marsden Hartley. I have come to love James Fitzgerald, and I am very thankful that you have joined us today, Susan Dan.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Mysteries that lead to discoveries. That's all in a day's work in the art world, and also in the auction world. Thanks to Dr. Susan Danley for joining us today, and we encourage you to come see Lot 4380 and many other outstanding works of art during our auction preview week. And be sure to bid in our Autumn Majestic auction, November 6th through November 9th. You'll find the complete catalog at thomastonauction.com. Kishri Dobson is at the piano, Dave Allen on the guitar, and the entire program is written, produced, and edited for you by yours truly, Elizabeth McLeod, who wishes you smooth sailing and happy bidding for Auction Waves. Auction Waves is an exclusive presentation of Thomaston Place Auction Galleries in Thomaston, Maine.